medicine physiologists. This is a continuation of our reproductive anatomy video. So we've covered male reproductive anatomy, and now we're on to female reproductive anatomy. Remember that the physiology will be covered in a future video. So unlike that of male reproductive anatomy, the female reproductive system is mostly internal. Here we see a picture of what we've seen before in the urinary system when we talked about male and female urinary anatomy. But now the focus is the reproductive structures. Okay, so remember, there's lots of similarities between male reproductive anatomy and female. And one of those things are gonads. And so the female gonads are the ovaries, which are here. So we have those ovaries as part of female reproductive anatomy, and that's where we make the sex cells, the egg cells, the oocytes, and hormones, of course. And then that egg will travel into this tube called the uterine tube. So the uterine tube comes next. And then from the uterine tube, that enters then the uterus. The uterus is that organ that grows during pregnancy and also like creates that lining and is shed during the process of menstruation. Off of the uterus is the cervix. So cervix is a neck-like structure. So there's the cervix there. I'll highlight it in yellow. And then from the cervix, then there's this channel called the vagina, which is a tube that opens to the outside. And so we're going to zoom in on each of these structures as we move through. Okay, so the first thing we're looking at here is an ovary. And remember, ovaries are the gonads in females, so they produce sex cells or eggs. And then some of those synonyms we've talked about for egg cells. So there's an egg cell, you can call it an egg, you can call it an ovum. Many ovums are an ova. You can call them an oocyte. And there's lots more. Those are just some three that I can think of right now. So the ovaries, they have many egg cells that are in various stages of development in little bubbles called follicles. So those are called ovarian follicles at various stages of development. The ovary has an outer tunica, right? Tunica's layer. Tunica albuginea. So it also has an outer white layer, just like the testes do. But there's an outer functional part, and that outer functional part is called cortex. The cortex is where most of those like follicles hang out, and then the middle functional part is called the medulla, and that's for like nerves and blood vessels and stuff. But once a mature follicle is released from the ovary into the uterine tube, that's called ovulation. So once ovarian follicle is released, that's called ovulation. And an ovarian follicle, again, contains a matured egg cell inside. We'll talk about process later. So what we're looking at here is a frontal view. And here we can see that ovary with all of those little follicles in it. And then that ovary will then release, I'm going to zoom in, will release that little egg cell into the uterine tube. But interestingly, the ovary isn't directly attached to the uterine tube. There's some structures that aid in kind of catching that released egg upon ovulation, right? And so this widened part of the uterine tube that kind of goes out like a trumpet, like that, is called the infundibulum. And the tip of that infundibulum have all these finger-like projections called fimbriae. And I think of the infundibulum with the fimbria as kind of like a baseball glove, you know? But there's these cells of the fimbria and the infundibulum also have cilia. So that kind of helps grab on to that little egg. Again, we'll talk about process later, but the egg cell will then move through that uterine tube, through this widened portion of the uterine tube called the ampulla, and then we'll enter the uterus through this structure called the isthmus. So the isthmus. That's how we get into the uterus. The egg cell then is sent along the line, like from here to there. So from the uterine tube into the uterus by waves of peristalsis, but also like the cells in this wall have cilia, right? So that helps kind of beat those eggs down the line, like the beating of the cilia. There's also cells that secrete like nutrients for sperms and for oocytes. But now that we're in the uterus, I want to point out to you how thick those walls are. The wall of the uterus is very thick, and there's 3 layers. So the first layer, I'll highlight everything for the uterus in pink, is the endometrium. The endometrium is that layer that gets built up and shed as part of the menstrual cycle. And menstrual cycle, that's a topic for another video. There's that muscular layer, myometrium. The myometrium is that smooth muscle layer that contracts during childbirth, and then an outer perimetrium. Also, as part of the uterus is the cervical canal. And the cervical canal is kind of outlined by this internal os and an external os. That word os is Latin or Greek or something for mouth. So there's an internal one and an external one. And that external one is usually covered by a mucus, by a viscous mucus. To help kind of seal off that bacteria from the uterus and make sure that like stuff can't get in there. But the mucus of the cervix becomes a lot less viscous during mid-menstruation, so like mid-cycle. And that's what helps allow sperm to pass through. Okay, but then we leave through the vagina, and the vagina is just a canal, but it's open to the outside. So this is stratified squamous epithelium. I'm going to write that down. So that mucosa is stratified squamous epithelium, which makes sense, right? Because we're going to try to reduce friction and all of the things. Um, and this is the organ of copulation in females, or of sexual intercourse in female reproductive anatomy. The vagina is pretty stretchy and it has, right, that mucosa, but that mucosa also has ridges, and those ridges are called rugae. We've already learned that word, rugae, just folds and ridges. The mucosa of the vagina does not have glands, so it must be lubricated by any mucosal fluid, like anything that's just being secreted from that mucosa, but also by the mucus of the cervix that's secreted onto that external os. There's also lots of beneficial bacteria that kind of set up shop here in the vagina, and they do fermentation. So it's pretty acidic in the vagina. And that acidity is actually good because it helps prevent infection. The flip side of this is that it's not a very sperm friendly environment. But remember that sperm is basic, so then that kind of helps neutralize everything. The vagina extends up and around the cervix. So here's that cervix, that neck-like structure, right? And then you see how the vagina kind of goes up. And remember, this is a 3D thing, so it goes like 360 degrees around. And so that part that goes up is called a fornix. And here, let's see, I'll label everything for the vagina in blue. So vagina here, we have the lateral fornix, meaning that it's on the side, but there's also like a front one, a back one, and then the other side is, of course, also the lateral fornix. Note that these organs are all found within the pelvis, which means that they're supported by ligaments, which I'll talk about next, but also by the muscles of the pelvic floor. So remember that the pelvic floor muscles are kind of like a bowl, right? So any dysfunctions or injury of the pelvic floor muscles can cause these organs to be less supported and can even like cause them to sag down a little bit downward, and that's called prolapse. And occasionally that prolapse can result in like the tip of the cervix protruding down into the vagina, or sometimes even portions of the rectum to kind of fall over into that vaginal wall. Okay, so that is all of the organs, and now I'm going to talk about all of these ligaments, but I'm going to do that on another slide because this slide's already got a lot of highlighting. Okay, so here's all those ligaments I was telling you about. Same slide, just I've cleaned it off. And all of those ligaments help make sure that everything is in that proper position. So one of the big ones is the broad ligament. The broad ligament consists of three major parts. But the broad ligament is like all of this stuff. All of that stuff, that's the broad ligament. The broad ligament consists of the parts that support the uterine tube. So supports, I'll zoom in. That's called the mesosalpinx. That word salpinx means trumpet-like. So referring to the trumpet-like situation of the infundibulum. So all of this mesosalpinx right there. There's also the mesovarium. The mesovarium supports the ovary. Mesovarium. Ovarium is the word that we care about there. And then lastly is the mesometrium, which supports the uterus. So all of this like flat part that kind of supports the uterus, that's all part of the broad ligament. The ovarian ligament connects ovary to uterus, but note that there's no like tube that connects, it's just a ligament that connects the ovary to the uterus. The suspensory ligament goes on either side. Oops, let me get my laser pointer instead of the highlighter. So we have a suspensory ligament that goes here and a suspensory ligament over here, and that helps stick that or attach everything to the pelvic wall, and that helps support everything in position. Lastly, there's a round ligament. The round ligament helps attach to the interior body wall. Interior body wall. By attaching to the interior body wall, it's really helpful for allowing movement of the uterus, right? Because the rectum and the bladder, they're always filling and emptying. We need to allow for a little bit of like loosey-goosiness, a little bit. But the round ligament also gets stretched on and pulled on as the uterus grows during pregnancy. So the round ligament can sometimes cause pain or soreness, especially during pregnancy. Okay, remember, I want you to think back to the endometrium because I have a picture. I have a picture for you of the endometrium. Here's a picture of that endometrial layer of the uterus. Notice how richly vascularized we are. Lots and lots of blood flow here. But the important thing is that we have some layers. We have the basal layer of the endometrium. The basal layer is always present. So the basal layer is always here. always present. And then, of course, underlying is the myometrium, that muscle layer. But we need to build up that endometrium as part of like preparing for fertilization, right? And that preparing for fertilization layer is called the functional layer of the endometrium. And look at how much like blood supply there is. And they're called spiral arteries that repeatedly degenerate and regenerate over time. Because we'll build up, prepare for fertilization. If fertilization happens, then this is where that egg will implant, that fertilized egg. But if that egg does not implant because it's not fertilized, then this whole layer will be shed during the process of menstruation. And again, more on process later. Most female reproductive anatomy is internal, but the external portions are shown here. The external female reproductive anatomy is called the vulva. External female anatomy. That's called the vulva. Colloquially, we call female reproductive anatomy the vagina, but it's really the vulva. Okay, so speaking of the vagina is just the canal, and here's that vaginal opening called the vaginal orifice. But also here is the external urethral orifice. And it's important to note here that these are two separate tubes. The vagina and the urethra are two separate tubes in female reproductive anatomy, which means that it's a little bit different from male reproductive anatomy, right? Because in male reproductive anatomy, those tubes would have been shared. But here they have completely separate jobs. Also being shown at the vaginal orifice is this structure called the hymen. The hymen, it's shown as ruptured here, so it's broken. But what happens is that during growth, the opening to the vagina, there's also this like incomplete little bit of mucosa, a little bit of vagina that still kind of closes off on the distal portion of the vaginal orifice. And that can be ruptured, that hymen can be ruptured during the first sexual intercourse, but also sports, inserting a tampon, or any other activities. There are two layers on the outer edges here of labia, or that word labia means lips. And so we have the labia minora, there's the small one. So the small ones are the labia minora. And then the larger ones on the outer edges are called labia majora. So the major ones and the minor ones. Notice that the two labia minora kind of come together at this peak, and that forms the prepuce of the clitoris. And that is kind of analogous to the prepuce of the penis. The labia minora also outline this area called the vestibule. The vestibule. So that's just like this whole outer portion that contains all of these structures inside. The mons pubis, this portion out here, is the area that kind of like overlies the pubic symphysis, and it typically starts growing hair after puberty, and then that hair also usually grows on the labia majora during puberty as well. Note that there's some openings for ducts here, and I'll talk about those in just a sec. So I want to show you a picture. Okay, so this is the same picture, but we just want to focus on the glands and stuff. So the gland that I was just pointing to those exit points are the greater vestibular gland. The greater vestibular glands release mucus to keep the whole area moist, but also lubricate the vagina during intercourse. And then this portion called so that was the greater vestibular gland is like the yellowish one. And then the grayish bluish one is called the bulb of the vestibule. The bulb of the vestibule isn't really a gland, it's like kind of like a erectile tissue because they engorge with blood during sexual stimulation. But also what we see here is the clitoris. We've had that prepuce removed so we can see more. We can see that that clitoris kind of extends up to the pubic symphysis. That's a little cartilage bit there. And then it has little attachment points on the side of the pubic bones. It consists, the clitoris, of erectile tissue, and it contains corpora cavernosa, which means that it can engorge and fill with blood during arousal. And it's also, like the penis, highly innervated, and that contributes to sexual response. Lastly, we'll discuss mammary glands as part of female reproductive anatomy. But mammary glands they're really just modified sweat glands, and they're present in both males and females. But they only usually function in lactating women, and this is done by the stimulation of hormones. So the mammary glands are contained in the breasts, which overlie the pectoral muscles. And each breast has an areola. I'll highlight that word areola. And that's that portion of like darkened skin. So it's just a little bit extra pigmented. And then in the center of the areola is the nipple. So the nipple, that's that structure there. And areolae they're kind of bumpy because they contain lots of sebaceous glands or oil glands. Um, and that helps keep the skin moist, reduce chapping, that kind of thing. Looking inside of the mammary gland, as we've done here in section, we can see that there's lobes of the mammary gland. So those lobes of the mammary gland are like these, like that's a lobe, that's a lobe, that's a lobe. They're like little sections. In each lobe, there's like these little grapes, and they're just like in lungs called alveoli. So there's lobules inside containing alveoli, and that's what produces the actual milk that gets secreted. That milk is then released into what's called lactiferous ducts. Let me show you what those are. So each of those, I'll zoom in here. So these lobules with alveoli then release that milk into these ducts, lactiferous ducts. They pass through a lactiferous sinus, and then the sinus part, that enlarged portion, is what allows for milk to accumulate while actively nursing. And again, we'll talk about that later. And then everything is released out of the nipple. Mammary glands, because all of these lobes are separated, the support for this are called suspensory ligaments. Suspensory ligaments. So the suspensory ligaments are like all these like bits of white, which provide a little bit of support because that attaches to the dermis, but also some of the other tissues. And I want to make this really important note to say that we're looking at the structure of a lactating woman's breast. But when not lactating, these structures are very immature. They're very small, they're underdeveloped, so the breast tissue is mostly consists of fat tissue in non-lactating women.